One of the issues often talked about in societies today is the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. It seems that the rich have everything, while the poor struggle just to survive each day. Now, without going into the politics or the morals of this very big issue that is oftentimes very complicated as well, I simply want to say this. We all have a duty, a responsibility, and an obligation to help those who are truly in need. And by truly in need, what I mean is that those who genuinely depend on our help and assistance, whether from government, from other agencies, etc., to live and survive because for whatever reason, they're not able to take care of themselves. Now, in the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 16, verses 19 to 31, there is a parable about a rich man and a poor man named Lazarus. Now, this is one of my favorite parables because it highlights many of the important themes, but the main one is the theme of charity. You see, out of the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, according to St. Paul, the apostles to the Gentile, charity is most important. It's most important because it demonstrates our faith through action. Charity is most important because it shows that we truly put God's commandment into practice, that is, to love our neighbor. So here I'd like to share 5 very important things about the parable of the rich man and the poor man named Lazarus. But before we enter the parable, allow me to briefly summarize this whole parable. So there are 2 characters. There's the rich man, and he doesn't have a name. And there's a poor man, and his name is Lazarus. The rich man has fine linens, fine clothing, purple, in fact, which is very special and very unique. And he dined sumptuously each day. Whereas the poor man, this beggar, is lying at his doorsteps, and he has sores all over his body, and dogs would come and lick his sores. Now, the rich man did nothing for this poor beggar named Lazarus. And at the very end, they both die, right? Lazarus dies and he goes off into the bosom of Abraham, whereas the rich man also dies. He was given a funeral and then he enters this place of torment. Now, from this place of torment, he's able to see Lazarus and he called out to Abraham. And he says, Abraham, get Lazarus to dip his finger into water and cool my tongue, right? But there's this chasm, so to speak, between the 2 sides. And Lazarus is not able to help this rich man, right? Who now is in this place of torment. And then as we see how it all progresses, there's this dialogue then between this rich man and Abraham, where this rich man tries to tell Abraham to allow him to appear, to return to his family, and to warn him of the dire consequences of their actions in this life. If they don't change, they're going to end up in a place of torment just like him. But Abraham says they have the laws and the prophets. Let them listen to them. And if they don't listen, well, then they'll end up in the same place of torment, right? So that's the summary of this parable. And here I'd like to share 5 very important things about this parable of the rich man and the poor man named Lazarus. Number 1, take a look at these 2 characters, the rich man and the poor man named Lazarus. The rich man doesn't have a name, as I've shared before. And if we look at the original text, the name for this rich man is divus, right? Divus is a Latin word which means rich, a wealthy man, in other words. And, the word divus is used at times throughout Scripture in the Latin, and we see it in some of the writings as well. Let me give you an example. The second encyclical of Pope St. John Paul II is Divus in Misericordia, which means rich in mercy. That is, God is rich in mercy. So the rich man, Divus, and then the poor man, Lazarus. Now, we've heard this name Lazarus before, right? Who else is named Lazarus? Think of Jesus' very good friend named Lazarus, right? There's Lazarus, there's Martha, and Mary. And so Lazarus is the one Jesus rose from the dead, right? He died, and on the 4th day, Jesus came and called out to Lazarus, Lazarus, come out. and Lazarus comes out of his tomb. So that's the other story from the Gospel of St. John. But here, the word Lazarus means the one whom God helps. The one who God helps. All right, so you have these two characters. You have the rich man and the poor man whose name is Lazarus. Now, number two I'd like to share. Being blind to those around you, especially those who are in need. And here, I'm not talking about physical blindness. I'm talking about spiritual blindness. That's right. Whereas we can see with our eyes, right? We can walk around, we have eyesight. But sometimes in our lives, we fail to see certain things that we should see. Let me give you a very clear example. Go into this parable right now. You have the rich man who dines sumptuously each day, who dressed in fine linen. But then there's a beggar at his doorsteps. You would imagine that maybe after a few days, at least a week, this rich man would have noticed, right? How can he not notice? He's not physically blind. We're not told he's physically blind. He is spiritually blind. He refuses to see this rich man. And I remember, one time when we were talking about this parable to a group of participants who were doing a Bible study group, many were scandalized. They say, how can this be? How is it possible that this rich man cannot see the poor man lying at his doorsteps? But the reality is, that's how the parable is, right? The rich man, for whatever reason, fails to see. And here in this point, I want to make one point very clear. You see, the rich man, what is his sin? What is his big mistake? Right? He didn't hurt Lazarus. He didn't harm him. He didn't beat him up. Right? He didn't do anything wrong. His sin then is that of omission. Right? He was in a position to do something, but he refused to do anything. Now just imagine, where is the love? Where is the charity? When you see a beggar at your doorstep like that and you ignore him the rest of your life, seriously, something is wrong here, right? Now, that's how the story is. And so this rich man, he is so off in his own world, he is blind to things that are around him. He is spiritually blind, if you will. Now, doing nothing is a choice. Doing nothing is what this rich man chose. He chose to rather focus on his own luxury, focus in on himself. Now that's something very interesting. It's called pride. Right? He's so focused on himself that he failed to see his surroundings, who's around him. He failed to see. And that's his main problem. That's his big issue. Number 3, having empathy and compassion for those in need, especially the poor. Now, in this parable of the rich man and the poor man named Lazarus, you see the rich can sometimes live in their own little world, right? And they're all focused in their own little bubble, so to speak, that they fail to see the bigger world outside. They fail to see especially those who are in need. But as disciples of Jesus Christ, we're all called to have empathy, compassion, and to do something, especially for those who are in need, like the poor, for example. Let me share with you a really brief story. Some time ago, I was talking to a group of college students, and one in particular shared with me a very beautiful and touching story. You see, this young man has grown up in a rich neighborhood all his life. Right? All his neighbors around him, they were driving Mercedes, BMW, Porsches. And so growing up, that's all he knew. And that's what his parents want him to know. Right? They gave him everything. They gave him money, they gave him wealth. And during summers, they would fly him to Hawaii, the Bahamas, great luxury vacations, etc. Until finally he went to college. And then in his second year, he did a 3-week trip to Ecuador. And that completely opened up his mind. Whereas before, he was just seeing the wealthy lifestyle, the rich and all of that. And then visiting Ecuador, it completely opened his eyes. And it helped him to recognize that in the world, there are poor people. There are those who are in need as well. Right? And so that really helped him to change in his perspective. And as he was sharing that, those who were around were touched by that experience as well. Because sometimes, our focus is so much in our own world that we fail to see everything that's around us. But we're called above all as disciples of Jesus to have love, compassion, and empathy for the poor. We treat all of them with dignity, with love, with respect, with great care, right? We do what we can to help them. In other words, Jesus' commandments to us: love your neighbor as you would yourself. So how would we love our neighbor? Well, by helping them, right? By doing everything we can for them. You see, this rich man treated the poor man, Lazarus, who was begging at his doorstep, with pretty much no mercy, right? Completely ignored the guy completely. And then this is where the parable gets very interesting. So now we move on to point number 4. Point number 4, death is the reality every one of us must face. You know, whether you are the richest person in the world or whether you are the poorest person in the world, sooner or later you will die. Death is a reality. All of us face death. And if you will, death is an equalizer to all things here in this world, right? All of us face death. And when we die, we come before God and we are judged, etc. Now, remember, in our lives, God calls us to live out the greatest commandment, right? To love God with our heart, all of our mind, all of our being, and to love our neighbor as we would ourselves, right? How have you loved your neighbor? I think that's the question that challenges you to really look within, to really look at your lives and really be honest and say, have I loved my neighbor as I have myself? Now, go back to this parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and let's ask the same question. Has that rich man loved his neighbor? I think the answer to that is pretty clear, right? And so point number 5, and the last point I'd like to make in this video here is the stewardship of the gifts and the talents which God gives to each one of us. Think about it. God gives to each one of us, time, talents, and treasure, right? So we all have time in our lives. We all have talent. We all have treasures in our lives. And, in order to fully understand well this parable, I invite you to go back and read the parable previous to this one. It's the parable about the dishonest steward. And then I invite you to go back and read one other parable, the parable of the prodigal son or the merciful father. In fact, I've made videos on all 3 of these topics because they're all interrelated and they speak of one very important theme, and that theme is stewardship. You see, in the parable of the prodigal son, the son squandered his wealth, right? So he's not a good steward. In the parable of the dishonest steward, he squandered his master's wealth, which is not, a good steward. And then here you have the rich man who has everything, but decides to do nothing. He showed no stewardship. And so that's the one common theme in all 3 of these parables. And Jesus is trying to invite us to reflect in our own lives all the gifts and all the blessings that God has given to us, and to ask this very question: what do we do with our time? What do we do with our talent? And what do we do with our treasure to build up God's kingdom here on earth and to love our neighbor as we would ourselves? So think about it. What do you do with your time? What do you do with your talent? What do you do with your treasure to build up this kingdom here on earth? Ultimately, what we choose to do with our lives is a choice God gives to all of us. The question is, what do we do with what God has given to us? How do we love our neighbor as we would ourselves? And as well, with this parable in particular of the rich man and the poor man Lazarus, I've also made another video on the lessons, the very lessons we can draw from this parable. And so I invite you to please watch that video next and to really reflect on the lessons that you can learn and how from this parable, and how you can be a better disciple of Jesus Christ, and how you can love your neighbor. May God bless you.